All right, so we are here for our first panel of the day. We have LaDarrion Williams, author of Blood at the Root. So as I call your name, just come to the stage. We have Hayley Dennings, author of This Ravenous Fate. We have Dr. Kinitra Brooks. We have Jewelle Gomez, author of the Gilda stories, and We Three. And we have Tananarive Due, who we all know very well. I think we have Tananarive Due. Okay, maybe we don't have Tananarive Due. Maybe. With this panel discussion, we're going to dive deeper into the historical context of Black horror. I feel like we're experiencing a golden age, but it goes way back beyond Get Out. So before we dive deeper into that, I would love for the panelists to give a 1 or 2 sentence self-introduction. It's just, I find that much cooler than me reading your bios. I can choose the order that we go, or y'all can choose the order in which we go.
Okay. Hi, I'm Tananarive Due, and I teach Black horror and Afro features at UCLA, and I'm an author and screenwriter.
Yay.
Thank you for your wonderful keynote. Yeah, it's inspiring. I'm Jewelle Gomez. I'm the author of a number of books of poetry, plays, but mostly known for the Gilda stories, which has been in print for more than 30 years.
Woo!
And Cheryl Dunye recently optioned it for a TV miniseries.
Yes! We love Cheryl and we love TV miniseries.
Hi, I'm following horror royalty. I'm just like spazzing out. All right, my name is Kinitra Brooks. I am the Audrey and John Leslie Endow Chair at Michigan State University. And they gave me that because I talk about Black women in horror all the time. So a lot of my work is where the horror genre and actual Black spiritual practices meet. And my current work focuses on the conjure woman in popular culture and history.
I'm Hayley Dennings. I'm so excited to be here with all of these icons. And I was born and raised in Oakland here, and my debut novel, This Ravenous Fate, came out last August. It's a sapphic vampire book set during the Harlem Renaissance. And yeah, it's my debut novel. And I mostly write, everything Black, obviously, but I'm like a huge fan of like angry, feral, queer girls and just like female rage. So that's really my brand here. And it's funny because I've been on like a bunch of different panels. This is my first horror panel, and I feel like horror is like the last thing people kind of look at. I've had my book called Romantasy before, which I don't think it's romantasy. Like, it feels a lot closer to horror, so it's really cool to actually get to talk about Black horror and have my book be featured as well.
Hello, my name is LaDarrion Williams. I am a playwright, author. My debut novel, Blood at the Root, features a Black boy from Alabama with ancestral magic, and he gets accepted into a magical HBCU in Louisiana. It came from a short film, and now it's a New York Times bestseller, so I'm glad about that. And the sequel is called Bones at the Crossroads, that comes out July. And yes, it was inspired by, Bone Thugs and Harmony, so yeah.
I gotta say this, I'm also a bookseller, in case you're wondering. And LaDarrion's publicist will Blood at the Crossbones is available for pre-order at Sister Sci-Fi. Okay, I've done that. Okay. So let's start at the very beginning. Tananarive Due, I don't know why, I'm so used to saying your first and last name together, so if that feels weird, it's because I'm weird. How do you define horror? How do you define Black horror?
Oh, okay. That should be an easy question to answer, but it's different things to different people. I teach it, horror very basically it's an emotion, right? So there are a lot of different kinds of work that you can interpret as horror. Often it's supernatural, but not always. That's my favorite kind, is supernatural horror. But there's also science fiction horror. Alien, Get Out is science fiction horror. Black horror is horror that is created by or stars or has Black protagonists with what I would call an authentic Black sensibility, and that's where you get into some dicey territory. But an ally who creates a Black protagonist isn't necessarily creating Black horror unless there are sort of recognizable cultural traits, and that's difficult to define. You know it when you see it, you know what I mean? But it's horror by Black artists or protagonists who are Black in Black stories.
What do we think about that definition? I'm opening up to the panel.
Very broad, I said, yep, very broad.
I think you have to keep definitions of Black horror broad because there's so much flexibility and fungibility because, you know, Black horror can be made by Black folks, but there are also, I always look at Wes Craven's The People Under the Stairs, which I think is a classic Black horror film, but it's created by Wes Craven. And there are places in which Black folks can find themselves in a horror film that does not necessarily center their Blackness. And so I think because we as a people have been forced to find ourselves and identify with people that may not even look like us. Tracy McMillan Cotton was just talking about Black folks' identification with redheads in teen movies in the 80s and this sort of outsiderness nature, that we have to have that ability to be flexible, to identify when necessary, even when we aren't there.
I like that.
I also think it's, part of it can be utilizing historical elements or ideas or, I'm never sure what this word means, tropes, that are uniquely African American and turning them on their heads or turning them inside out. I think you'll often find in Black horror that, you know, there's slavery and various ways it gets treated in horror novels, especially, that's very different from how a white writer would treat slavery. Things not even so large, but sort of behaviors, you know, that we identify as connected to us and have over time been identified with us, but then reusing them in a different way. I don't want to give any examples of behaviors because I'm sure to offend somebody.
Because I was like, what are the examples? Like, what are because I'm thinking about like the use of time. Like, I'm thinking of like cultural aspects. I'm thinking of like, you know, from everything from My Soul to Keep to Blood at the Root, like those cultural references, right, which makes it Black horror as opposed to like a deeply melanated person who's the main character, right? Excited about responses. I'll also make a PSA here. So I will leave time for audience questions. And as soon as I'm like, are there any questions from the audience? I'm gonna see like a bunch of hands, and the questions are gonna be amazing, and they're gonna be actual questions, and that they end in a question mark, right? So I'm excited. So yeah. So thoughts on like, what makes Black horror Black horror? What are examples? How do we get specific about that definition?
I think in my case, a lot of times generational, like, you know, things like we always talk about breaking the generational chain, right? And how that goes from one generation and how it manifests into another. I think about, it's not Black, but like the movie Babadook. and how the mother was dealing with, I think she was dealing with a grief and like, and how it physically manifested into like this monster. So I think about, especially like young Black kids, like when they have like their innocence stolen away from them or taken away from them, and like how they deal with childhood trauma, and how do they navigate through that, and how does the childhood trauma, you know, physically manifest. Like for Malik, like, you know, it's 4th of July, he's hearing the fireworks, right? And he's seeing, you know, he's seeing his mom, he's seeing the childhood home, which is something personally that I've gone through, dreaming about my childhood home and realizing that a lot of the trauma that I experienced happened in a space that was supposed to be created as, you know, as a safe space. And so how did that manifest in my life and, you know, throughout, so.
Yeah, and kind of continuing off of that, I definitely see, at least like in my own stories, the theme of intergenerational trauma being really big, and definitely like physical manifestations of that. And I mean, I see it in like Beloved. Maybe not everyone sees that book as horror, but I think like especially like with the ghosts, you know, being a manifestation of, you know, the trauma and history of slavery in the U.S. I see it there as well. And I also see it as, you know, kind of like a reclamation of sorts, as I think especially in Gothic horror stories, a lot of times the monsters would be kind of stand-ins or representations of marginalized identities that people were warned against, you know, staying away from. And so with Black horror, I did that like with my book, The Vampires, and turning that around and, you know, showing people that you don't have to be ashamed of these identities, and, you know, it's okay to actually be yourself and to be proud of your Blackness and to no longer hide behind these like monstrous kind of stereotypes that people have placed onto us.
For me, I think a characteristic that I often look for and find in Black horror is, particularly in supernatural horror, the treatment of traditional African religious practices. So the treating of them, because what got me into horror was seeing like the scary voodoo woman and stuff like this, and then reading Black women's horror, like You're the Good House, and where, you know, the traditional, it was Vodou, right? In Vodou, where it was treated with respect as a place of power, as something not to be afraid of. Was there a Bokor? Was there someone evil doing Vodou? Yes, but also that was the key. Connecting to those ancestral practices was the key to recovering and healing from the trauma. And we see that in LaDarrion's work, where conjure is seen as a movement and a place of power, not something to be scared of and not something to be afraid of. And I always use it to talk to my students, and particularly my Black students and other students of color, of saying, like, why are you afraid of this? And you're afraid of this because of the Haitian Revolution and because it gave your people the strength to fight back. And I go back and I talk about this, you know, why are you cool with looking at, who's that, in the Marvel, Chris Hemsworth? Thor. Why are you cool with looking at Thor? Thank you. and but scared of Shango, right? Yeah. Like, what's going on here? It's actively working, and you're leaving power on the table, and you're leaving self-knowledge on the table. Yes. And you don't leave power on the table.
Yes.
That is brilliant. Your
I never leave power on the table.
You don't play.
Yes. And we definitely know we're not leaving any power on the table in 2025. LaDarrion, what movie or book do you think defines the history of Black horror for you? And I know you're like, wow, she put me on the spot, but I did send you the questions in advance.
You did, and I saw it. I was like, I don't. What movie defines it? Is this like a personal taste type of thing? Or?
Totally personal. This is not an essay question. You can't get it wrong. Like,
okay, I don't. Okay, I have a movie and a music video though. So the movie I remember growing up watching all the time was Tales from the Hood. Like how it took a lot of things that I felt like I identified with, especially with Paula J. Parker's character and how she was abused, and how the son was seeing his mother being abused by the dad. Like I really related to that. I thought that really kind of encapsulated like everything that I was going through. And then it talks about police brutality. It talks about ancestry, like with the little dolls, like how they would come to life and they would save, like, you know, the people in the house. And so I think that the music video for me, I was always affected by Bone Thugs and Harmony, Meet Me at the Crossroads, because I was like, a black man in a long trench coat, and he has like glasses, and he's going around the hood and he's touching everybody, and they're all like dying. And I was like, what is that? Like, and I didn't know that as a 5 or 6 year old. I know I wasn't supposed to be watching that music video, but growing up, I was like, oh, like, are they kind of commenting? It could be the Angel of Death, but also that could be Banwan Semdi, who is, you know, the Haitian Loa of the dead. You know, I was like, oh, like that's kind of cool. So I think that for me, that kind of like black horror, like setting it like in the hood and seeing like black folks just going on about their regular lives, and then they can drop at the, you know, at the drop of a hat. So it's like, for me, that's what I kind of, you know, see.
I just thought of something.
Yes.
That, you know, taking the familiar, what we associate with blackness, and then using it, Attack the Block. I don't know if people have seen that film.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorites. Oh, God. And, you know, it's that the young black male, and they're in England, so it's a really different twist on it, but it's very familiar, young black male. They've got that braggadocio, and, you know, with the caps and the swagger, and you're both afraid of them because they're going to mug you, but you're also proud of them because they're strong and taking up space for themselves in a culture that doesn't want them to. And then, when the monsters arrive, it is that very character that has them, that they've had to use to survive, that gets them to overcome the monsters. To me, that really is quintessential black horror.
Yeah, thank you for bringing in that example. Yeah. Any other examples? Any other examples in terms of movies or television films that we feel like encapsulate the history of black horror?
I mean, these two are, oh, sorry. I can't wait to hear what you have to say. These two are very different. And I know Toni Morrison did not consider Beloved to be horror, from what I read. But art is in the eye of the beholder. And I very much consider it to be horror because of the ghost. And it's the ghost that makes it as palatable a story as it is. And it's a very difficult story. But the function of that story is to help you try as much as you can through the veil of time and history to understand what it felt like to have been enslaved, right? And I think that she nailed that. In terms of a film, weirdly, because on the surface it has nothing to do with racism and oppositional racism, Eve's Bayou. Because it's just, they happen to be black, right? I mean, they have that history that she was, you know, the woman who owned the land was formerly enslaved, so there's this distant racial history, and it's in segregated communities, so there's some unspoken segregation happening. But it's about just a family and horror inside the home, which is so universal. So those to me are like the two, like sometimes, really it's revolutionary just to have black people in a horror story at this point. And to answer your earlier question, the only things that to me are not black horror were people who are sort of cynically inserting race, especially if they're not black creators themselves.
Okay.
Sort of cynically inserting race to try to capitalize on a trend. Ma would be a good example of that. So I didn't, you know. But yeah, I think they know. I told them about it. Ma was not, to me, black horror. It was, yeah.
What was it?
Ma, the movie from Blumhouse.
Absolutely. Oh, I don't care. I got tenure. I'll say anything when I don't.
I'm here for it. We're on the Spill app, so let's spill the tea. So
For me, I think what really tried to do everything, maybe not all the way successfully, was Lovecraft Country. Yes. Because it went through so many different types. We went from a haunted house story, and a lot of people were like, it's inconsistent. We started out here, we started here. because they were trying out the different types of horror and putting them through a Black lens.
Yes.
Some of them worked better than others, but also this overarching theory of the supernatural and talking about racism and magic and all of these things. Even bringing in the cosmic horror of Cthulhu and all of that. So of having these many different types of Black horror through a Black lens and talking about and experimenting with it, I thought was very, very ambitious and very, very rich text.
I want to say, like, I don't know if we consider this, but what about the piano lesson that just came out on Netflix? Is that kind of considered
Do you
Black
consider
horror?
Black horror?
No?
Piano lesson, August Wilson.
By August Wilson, yes. Because Candyman is, yeah.
Which one?
So I think, so
I like
let's,
both.
yeah, so let's talk about the piano lesson, and then also let's talk about Candyman, because it's hard to talk about Black horror in cinema and not talk about Candyman, and so if this is a place to talk about it. So yes, with the piano lesson first.
I wouldn't necessarily counter it as horror, but I do think that there are ways in which, I think this is where we start to get the cross currents of the conversations between horror trauma, dealing with traumatic experiences and those sorts of things, and what goes into and pushes it over into horror. But I don't ever want to be prescriptive because there are ways in which you can insert that in there. So I don't want to put like, no, that's not horror. There are ways in which you can find horror in many different things. I think this has always been the conversation with Beloved, because all of us who were horror fans were like, this is a haunted house story, right? This is a ghost story, right? While, you know, people who wanted to be really like, this is literature. Well, horror is literature too, right? We can have that as well. They don't have to be separate. So I think there are ways, and with us being a genre and the horror genre and it being ghettoized, and so historically, we've had to find those places for the horror to exist. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious because, you know, it just came out and like it dealt with like Sutter's Ghost and like the piano and like the ancestors and they were being attacked in this house. So I was just like very curious if that would be considered.
No, I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Candyman.
How many times are you going to say that? I mean, obviously Candyman is horror. We can all agree Candyman is horror. I like what Dr. Coleman said in her book, that it's Blacks in horror more so than Black horror, because the original Candyman is Black trauma, ostensibly, but through a white lens, right?
Yeah.
And that was how the original, by the way, the original short story had no mention of Blackness. So that's something that happened when they Hollywoodized it, and they had to make it Cabrini Green, the big, scary. In fact, you know, there's a lot that's kind of offensive. I mean, I love Candyman, but at the same, and I love R.I.P. Tony Todd. I was so sad when he passed. But there was very problematic aspects to that first movie in inserting race in some clumsy ways that I think Nia DaCosta tried to remedy in the new one.
Because it was kind of, I always had that question even as a young kid. I don't know why I was watching it again. I was like, okay, so the white people killed him, but why is he going to the hood and killing? I never understood that.
Absolutely.
Like I never understood. I was like, why is he
Absolutely.
killing the Black people in the hood?
Yeah.
And didn't mess around with white women get you caught in this predicament, but
But you go kill the Black kids? So, okay.
I'm just saying some lessons need to be learned over and over again.
I mean, yeah, Cabrini Green didn't do nothing. Like, I'm just like.
But what I won't say is let's talk about Candyman. So next question. So Jewelle, this question is for you. How do you define healing? Historically, how has horror been a catalyst for healing in the Black community?
Well, I think we're still discovering, people of color are still discovering what healing is and what is needed. It's gone from let's pave over everything and move forward. Let's be as middle of the road and wealthy and whatever as the mainstream is and we'll be fine. And I think we're starting to get to that moment where we understand that sometimes wounds are so deep, the doctors have to suture on several layers down before they can close up the top. And that's where I think we are now. We need to get to those layers underneath that have been traumatized by living under the dominant culture here. And it's not a pleasant thing. It's not a, it's not a happy thing. I mean, I think humor and music contribute to healing in our communities. All my plays, the trilogy I just finished and was performed here in San Francisco and in New York, are full of music and humor, because I really do believe they are key to healing. On the other hand, I feel like horror gets us to open up, pull the scab off, open the wound, go down to that place where we're feeling vulnerable, and we really don't want people fucking poking in it, you know? But you have to in order to pull out the poison. And we're walking around with a lot of poison inside of us. And, scientists are proving it now, but we always knew the trauma that was experienced from the Middle Passage forward is still inside us. It's in our cells. So for me, horror is a way that we can dig down deep and give ourselves a place to scream, because that's what we really need to do. There's a concept, a phrase, Hebrew, tikkun olam, which is, and I'm sure this concept is in many other cultures, this just happens to be the one I know. It's healing the world. That's what tikkun olam means. And it's a principle of the Hebrew religion. And it has three things. One is to review what's happened. One is to analyze what has happened, to do self-examination around what has happened, and then do action. And I think horror allows you, particularly any horror that involves historical material, allows you to review. How did you get here? How did we get here? What is it we felt was done? What do we feel like we're doing? Because often we're participating in the horrific things that are happening because we hurt each other. Those to whom evil has been done will do evil in return. But I think horror gives us those opportunities to reflect, reassess, and act emotionally, and learn. I mean, one of the most amazing and important things in my writing life was when I first started doing the Gilda stories, and my editor, the publisher, Nancy Bariano, said that, she agreed to publish it, and we spent a year editing it. And at one point she said, I really, this is so interesting, but do you really want to write a book in which the main heroic character is a serial killer? And I hadn't thought about it because I was a big Dracula fan, and all the vampire movies, I'd seen all of them at like 12 times. And so I was just writing a vampire story. And when she said that, it meant I had to rethink, what is a vampire? And how does a vampire exist who isn't a serial killer? And not make it so boring, people just throw the book in the fireplace. But it changed the way I thought about vampires. Consequently, it changed my writing, and it changed how I thought about myself. That I, lesbian, feminist, radical, just was following down, Bram Stoker's path, without considering what it meant to be writing about a woman who escapes from slavery, who's had no power, and now has power over life and death. How do I make that shift? And because I was asked that question, it did shift the way I think about it. Horror and the power of horror, both for the writer as well as for the reader.
And so, this is the second time I've heard you share that anecdote, and I'm so grateful that you were asked that question, because Gilda and her practice of vampirism, when I read it, was like so healing, right? And just like that, yeah, so thank you. Any other thoughts on horror and healing and that linkages?
I think for me, I think reclamation, right? Like for Blood at the Root, we all know that, that line, blood on the leaves, blood at the root. We all know, like especially in the South, lynchings, and so I wanted to take that back and give it power, and also when I was in college, I was at a PWI, predominantly white institution, during Trayvon Martin's case, and I was seeing you could tell all the black students on campus we were just going through it, and the white, a lot of the white students was just going on about their merry way, and I remember having a conversation with my mom about not wearing a hoodie, and even though it's like 30 degrees in Tennessee, like don't wear a hoodie, because that was placed on us as a stereotype. So that's why I wanted to put this black boy on this cover back into a hoodie, to say, like, no, this is his armor, this is his power. And also showing him he's standing on the same soil that his ancestors fought and bled on, standing in front of a Spanish moss tree, and he's literally the amalgamation of their wildest dreams. And so I think it's like reclaiming it, and I think that's how we heal, through that. So that's my thoughts on that.
I love that notion of reclamation. I think that's what Nia DaCosta did with Candyman, was to reclaim that story for us. Oh, you want to talk about us? Let's us talk about us, right? But also what goes hand in hand with horror. A lot of us think about monsters chasing you, demons chasing you. There's so much focus on the monster. For me, it's the protagonist who is the focus. And to see that power, like maybe I'm not as strong as the monster. Maybe I'm not as ancient as this demon. But I am going to do my damnedest to outsmart you, to overpower you, to stick you back in your hex box wherever you came from. And often they succeed. And that is the model I love of that power against overwhelming forces, because that's what we're facing in life.
And I wanted to add that a lot of horror is folks' first introduction to working with the dead. And a lot of times it's from a place of fear. But just as you said, like, that demon that's so overwhelming, but what if it's an ancestor or a spirit that's filled with love, right? How powerful can that be? So you get to, a lot of times I get to take the horror conversation, oh, you're scared of this demon, oh, you're scared of these spirits and these ghosts, but what about people who believe in ghosts? What about people who, I always think of Bones. Remember when the Jesus is a zombie conversation? Oh, okay, maybe that didn't go over well. But I'm Christian and other stuff. But these concepts of why do we call this person this or this spirit this and not this spirit that? Whose spirits are we posing and calling evil and demonic, right? Why? It gets us to bring these sort of questions that brings this sort of healing from the trauma of being afraid of ancestral veneration, of being afraid of the stories we've heard about our family, even those people in pain, but knowing that there's a way for us to communicate and work with these folks and do this work, if necessary, not from a place of, I have to exercise and get rid of everything.
Great. So my next question is for you, Dr.
Oh, okay.
What are some of the pivotal moments in Black horror, and how does this influence your work?
Okay, I think one of the first pivotal moments is what Linda Addison refers to when she talks about Zora Neale Hurston and her collection of Haint stories and devil tales. That shows that even enslaved, we were trying to scare each other, that we enjoyed horror, right? We liked the tingle that it gave us. So I always say Black horror is nothing new. We've always enjoyed this. It's just about now and in these last 20, 30 years, us being recognized as valid audiences for the genre. I would then go into the 1930s, where you start to get Uangu, Son of Uangu. You get sort of those movies, those Black movies that would play in the theaters, and that would show sort of during the day, and there would be these all Black films, the ones by Oscar Micheaux and all of that. But there will also be these sort of B movies, right? That's where they come from, the B movies that would show, and some of them were horrific. Some of them had ghost stories, some of them were haunting tales and those sorts of things. And then I think you start to get into Blaxploitation era, where we get Blackula, where we get Blackenstein, right? Where we get Abby, which is the remake of The Exorcist, the Black remake of The Exorcist. So it doesn't last 7 minutes when when a Black family happened with Abby. Then I think, I know, oh yeah, Ganja and Hess, right? Which is this like art house movie, but also there are vampires in it, and it's very good looking. They're gorgeous. Everyone's beautiful, and everyone's in like this. I mean, she dressed so well. Oh my gosh. Okay, like randomly off the Paris runways, and then I would go into the '80s, which is where we still no. Then we get Night of the Living Dead. I think Night of the Living Dead is just pivotal. Where we get a Black male protagonist who survives to the end until he doesn't. And then we get into, I think, the 80s and 90s, where you start to get some Black filmmakers, Black directors and writers, and getting a chance at bat to tell their stories in different ways. And I think the 90s and until the heyday of when we get Out. Yeah.
No, if you can put the, no, yes, I mean, if you, they told me to make sure that everybody has the mic super close to the mouth, like we see.
Okay, yes. So, and then I think those are a lot of the highlights, although that there are, threads in between where you'll get a small film or a TV show or something like that. And we also can't forget about music, because when you were talking about video, Michael Jackson's Thriller, right? Where we get a zombie film, yeah.
I love it. You hit several major beats. There is a playlist accompanying this event, which includes Thriller amongst several other musical tracks, so I'm sure that's in the Ethernet somewhere.
I'm glad that you mentioned Night of the Living Dead, because I wanted to make sure that came up, because it is such a pivotal thing, even though it was not a Black movie. But Dwayne Jones was so iconic. One, his performance is pretty amazing. Yeah. But it set a kind of tone about where Black people were going to be in the movies. And I had the good fortune of working with Dwayne Jones in theater, because when he retired from the movies, he ran a theater company in New York, and I was a stage manager for years in another life, when I was young enough to scrabble around on these lights and shit. But his fans, everybody loved him, and it was a Black theater, and they were always taking him aside to ask him, so what happened when and what? And finally, one day, he said to a bunch of us, I will really look forward to the day when the Black person can live through past the end of the film and not be the one to die. And that clicked for me. This was in like 76 or 77. And from then on, I knew there was a mission to writing horror that included people of color, that we had an honorable duty to give that life respect and not just use it as a fodder, which is what I think Dwayne Jones felt like. He was fodder.
And I'm really happy to report, was it last year, the book, The Black Girl Survives, and this one was published, and somebody was like, spoiler. I'm like, so? So what?
Yeah, that's
And you wrote the foreword, and we did have copies, but they're sold out. We also have copies of The Black Guy Dies First, which is also another book by Robin Meads Coleman. This last question before I open it up to your questions, which will be so amazing. I cannot wait to hear them, is for you, Hayley. How do you decide whether to have a historical setting versus informing readers about the past? So you can take us to 1920s Harlem, or you can tell us about the 1800s. How do you decide which to do with your reader?
I mean, the main theme that I like to explore in my books is intergenerational trauma, and specifically within Black communities and how different people deal with, their different traumas. And so, like, my book is dual point of view because each girl, like, has a different way of dealing with their pain. I wanted to, I'm writing for a young adult audience, and I wanted to tell younger Black girls, or, just younger audiences in general, that, however you need to deal with your grief and your trauma is gonna be valid for you. And I think for me, like, the reason why I chose historical is because, like, when I was younger and I was learning about history, so much of it was about our trauma, and I wanted to have a more, like, nuanced conversation about Black history and to show people that, there are parts of our history that we might not know, but, like, maybe in reading about it and reading stories that aren't just, written by the white man, but written by people who look like you, it can be a more honest tale of what happened. And I think also, just for me, like, I obviously wanted like a more honest account of that, but then also looking back in the 1920s, I talk about in my book, things that happened even hundreds of years before then, and how those problems, like back when the first enslaved Africans arrived to the United States, like, they're still relevant in the 1920s and then still relevant now in the 2020s. And I think especially because I was writing for a young adult audience, like, I knew as myself, like, I was really bad at history class in school because, like, it was a lot of information. Like, I have a terrible memory. But, like, getting to hear actual stories and, like, seeing, like, a fantasy point of view, it really helped me engage with the real life, like, historical moments in a different way. And so, like, I was always really inspired by historical fantasy authors like R.F. Kuang and S.A. Chakraborty, who wrote the David Bad trilogy and the Poppy War trilogy. I just think it's such a genius way to get to, shine light on real life moments that have been erased in the past, but then also, like, make it kind of more engaging, especially for a younger audience who isn't ready to sit through, like, a 1,000-page textbook. But, they can still feel like they're the hero or existing in a story that maybe they never got to see themselves existing in before.
Thank you. Okay, so this is where we open it up to questions. Oh, yay, Dwayne! Ideally, please wait for the mic. Panelists, if for some reason somebody asks a question and they don't have the mic, if you can repeat the question for the recording.
I had to write my question down to make sure I was asking it the way it came out of my mind. My name is Dwayne. I'm a Black queer fantasy writer myself. And so I've always really been interested in the intersection or the crossroads between fantasy and horror. In your keynote speech, Tananarive, you kind of talked about how Octavia can be considered horror sometimes. I just got finished reading Mind of My Mind for the first time, and Doro's character is terrifying. I mean, this kind of scary monster in a lot of ways who has the last say on everything. And so I was just kind of wondering if you all could talk a little bit about the intersection between horror and fantasy, and how that maybe shows up in horror, or how fantasy kind of sometimes bleeds into horror, or vice versa sometimes.
Thank you.
That's a good one. I mean, I'll just glance across it, and then for more depth, you'll want to talk to the other panelists. Because my definition of horror is so broad, like you just said, is it scary? I mean, that's the first thing. Is it scary? Then for you, it's horror, isn't it? And fantasy, I mean, horror is fantasy, actually. I mean, it's imaginary, unless you actually believe in zombies, whatever. Let's just stay with zombies. They're not real. And the fantasy is the realm of the not real. Places that aren't real, creatures that aren't real, right? So there's a lot of overlap between the horror and fantasy, as far as I'm concerned. And the difference between adventure fantasy, and which I think a lot of fantasy is also adventure fantasy, and horror fantasy is, in adventure fantasy, you have people who are well-primed and well-prepared for the battles at hand, and in horror, often you have characters who are completely unprepared. And this is just very general. There are tons of exceptions occurring to me even as I'm speaking, but that is one of the differences to me. But again, eye of the beholder.
I think fantasy begins to come in with the concept of the world building that happens in horror. A lot of times I see horror as very intimate, and it'll begin very intimately and whatever, but as the world grows, right, even taking zombie horror, let's look at the remake of Dawn of the Dead, just because lots to unpack there. It begins in her house, right, where the little girl from next door comes in, and she attacks the husband turns to a zombie and whatever, and then she leaves her house and the world expands. And at that point, she has to learn the rules of the world, even in horror, but in fantasy, it's about world building, learning the rules, how that world operates, etc. So a lot of times I see fantasy and horror intersecting when you expand the world of horror, and the people in the horrific situation have to learn the rules, right? The first, Nightmare on Elm Street, right? It's Freddy, he's to that neighborhood, to those kids in that neighborhood. It's the tale of what happened with him, because he was the accused pedophile for the neighborhood. But as you get to Nightmare on Elm Street 3, 4, 5, it's fantastic at this point, because the world has expanded and Freddy is his own thing outside of Elm Street, right? Elm Street becomes it's not specific that way. So I see fantasy coming into the horror world building and expanding it, right? Jason is beyond Camp Crystal Lake, right? He's been to space, he's been to New York City, right? Jason is not a fantastical character, right? Yeah.
I guess for me, when you're in school, you're always hearing about the civil rights and the slavery and the horrors of it. But I'm always curious, and I've always been like this. I'm like, well, what if we can go back in time, and what if we can change the outcome? And just kind of Back to the Future, how Marty McFly goes back in time to change the outcome of his parents, right? So I was always curious in that, but also, not understanding, and that comes from fear as well. You were talking about Black spirituality. Having a conversation with my mom, and she's a Black Southern woman. She's like, "Why do you always write about that magic stuff, that devil stuff?" And I'm like, "Okay, we're gonna have to have a conversation." Cause I'm like, "Oh, you're real big and bold saying all of that, but you got a cinnamon broom on your wall, where do you think that came? What do you think that came from? And why do you think Auntie, why do you think Auntie blah 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 was sweeping the porch, back of the house to the porch and to the street? Why do you think, you be in church all the time and you're falling, being filled with the Holy Spirit? We're realizing that's ancestral and that's been passed down. So I'm always curious of blending horror, the slavery and civil rights, and also in Blooded Through, the Haitian Revolution, because we were taught to be afraid of that. But when I did my research, I was like, I would love to have an IMAX theater experience to the Haitian Revolution. And I was they're calling upon their gods to come down and help them with the war. I'm like, gods? What gods are there? Because I only learned about Greek mythology. I didn't even know there were Orishas and black gods and Loas and spirit, deities. And I was like, wait a minute, there's gods that look like me out there, and they're powerful, and they get to throw hammers and swords, and they help these people. And even realizing that there's even stories about even Abdurai Otoya, this black woman led the the army against these people. And there was rumors that she was like a vampire. Like she had super speed and super strength, and she was feeding on the blood of the white Frenchman. So I was like, wait, this is so cool. And blending fantasy, like I want to go back in time and I want to like experience that, but also teaching my main character, or having my main character be taught the history of that and having that power within him. And now he can change the future with that, because now he learns the ways of his ancestors and that they didn't give up. And now he has that power, literally that magic that's inside of him, that's coursing through his veins to kind of enact all of that and with the horrors around him. He's learning about the Bokors. He's learning about how, the deities are coming back and they're kind of fighting for a place in this world, and he's fighting for a place in this world, and he's trying to heal himself through the trauma of like his childhood trauma. So it's just, that's how I think we can blur it. Yeah.
I love it. So this next question will be our last question, because Naomi's like, look at the clock, girl. So yes. Oh, dang. In the middle with the blue scarf, mask.
Thank you so much. Firstly, thank you all so much for being here. I know everybody here appreciates it. Tananarive, you and I had the chance to speak before the event, and you mentioned horror as processing. And then you said you're tired of processing and you just want to celebrate. And Ms. Gomez, I feel you touched upon this slightly when you talked about music and humor as part of healing. Mr. Williams, I feel you touched upon this when you talked about reclamation. So my question for all the panelists is, how can horror celebrate Black joy? How does it celebrate Black joy? What are some of your favorite examples, including from your own works? Or is that not the purpose of horror?
Can we talk about the blackening? Okay.
I mean,
That
I think that is a good question. I think we in our horror stories, as in life, you have to sort of snatch those moments of joy in between the moments of horror, right? So one of the things that helped me get through writing the reformatory, because it's a tough story, 1950 at a reformatory, a child is locked up, is that my protagonist was 12, and he had that childlike sense of play. So I would have just been sobbing under my bed all night. But he's like, let's race and and let's talk about comic books, or let's play in the freezer. Like those kinds of things an adult in that situation probably wouldn't be doing is what helped me get through the process of writing the story. Like Robert's innocence and his, even though he was very frightened, his sense of joy just in being a child.
Honestly, did you want to?
I'm finally writing the sequel to the Gilda stories, and I gotta hit send sometime this week, so it's really right on my mind. Really, I'm writing as I'm sitting here. But there's a moment in the sequel, and it's I think of the Gilda stories as kind of mythological, not very hard hitting. It has some good ideas in it, but it's really kind of mythic. This one is a little bit tougher, and it starts with Gilda trying to decide if she wants to take the true death, and the whole novel is her turning that over in her mind because, anyway. And so at one point a character says to her that she thinks she's amazing because of her, there's such faith. And Gilda's like, no, I don't want you to be having faith in me. I am not a goddess. I'm none of those things. And she said, no, you have faith in us. You have faith in the mortals. And that makes Gilda think about what it is that's really brings her joy. And it is not necessarily that she gets to live as long as she wants, but that the people she encounters around her, if she can believe in them, then she has joy and she can live as long as she wants to. And the moment that she no longer has faith in humankind, you have to read to the end of the book and find out.
Yeah, honestly, I feel like I'm like the worst person to answer this question because I'm a very angry person and it really translates into my books, like about just that primal rage. And I also really love tragedies. So when I write, for me, it's really cathartic to like be honest about those feelings and to have those feelings validated. And like I've had conversations with my friends who they're like, I'm tired of, trauma, like, and being traumatized. And I'm like, I totally get that. But like for me, it's like I have all these things that I need to like release into my stories. And of course, I do still have these moments of levity. Like, I think the biggest thing for me in my books is my characters finding those connections through those emotions. And like in my book, the joy for me was watching these two girls like find love and forgiveness with each other. And I'm not like a humorous person, like my books are not rom-coms, but there are those moments where they're celebrating with their families and they're just happy to be around people that they love. And so I think that joy can look different for different people, and those feelings of relief are just as important as moments where people are just celebrating as well.
Yeah, I think, for me, through music and music and television, because I remember watching Lovecraft Country, and it was the episode where the Ingenue Ellis, who is amazing, when she was like in space and she was trying to, gather, all the information what was happening, and she's like, I am Hippolyta, like that is such a powerful statement that she was saying, and she would go through all these times, and I was with that brought me a lot of joy. I'm not a black woman, but I felt that because I felt kind of lost in a lot of in a lot of my journey, and I'm like, I am this, I am that, I gotta claim it. And it was also Beyonce's Black is King. And listening to the Gift album, I know a lot of people ask, where the visuals? She did drop the visuals, and it's Black is King, but a lot of people didn't support it. Amen. And I remember like that story being about a young black boy coming from the motherland and coming over here and being lost, and he's like regaining his power. And it was that song, on the other side, and how she was just talking, she would look at the clouds and she would say the ancestors in the cloud, but she was, singing in Swahili. And I'm like, that's just so much joy. That brought so much joy to me. And so I translated all of that through this book, and it's with the character Malik and his little brother, Tay. And Tay doesn't have magic, but he loves Malik, and he loves the fact that he has magic, and Malik is so afraid of it. But when he looks to Tay, he's like, wow, there's so much joy in his eyes, and I'm trying to give him the childhood he never had. And it's like, well, Malik, and Tay tells him, like, you're just a kid too. Like, we're both kids, and we both experience a lot of heartache, but we have each other. And like, allowing Malik, allowing the 17-year-old black boy be vulnerable, and saying I love you, and being soft, and saying, I made mistakes, but look at my little brother who is 12, but he's going on 30, and he has so much wisdom. And so I got all of that joy through, watching Black is King and watching, Lovecraft Country, because, that's where I got it from.
Beautiful. And I would say, in questions of finding the joy, I think we would have to start to investigate why we love horror so much. And the idea that we get to see someone else and identify with someone else who's going through these horrific experiences, but we get to experience their horror from the safety of our couch. We get the catharsis there. Right? So that brings us a certain joy. I think we also, in looking at Black horror, have to look at things such as Vampire in Brooklyn, The Blackening, right? There are ways in which we specifically mix horror and laughter together in ways that are quite joyful, right? And that we will find places to have joy even in the most horrific circumstances, right? I talk with John. John talks all the time about the laughing barrels that enslaved folks had to laugh inside barrels. But that also shows that we were laughing. We were having a good time and enjoying each other, right? So those things cannot be disentangled from the other.
Well, thank you. Y'all are,